Hi, this is Patrick Noonan of Outer Park. I'm here with a couple of my Outer Park bandmates, Charles Tobermann in Orléans, France, and James Singleton in New Orleans, Louisiana. And we've been working through our song by song series talking about the material on our album 1968 Slight Return. And today the three of us are going to talk a little bit about a song called King Kong by Frank Zappa. It's an instrumental piece. We do it as a long jam. We had Jason Marsalis on the drums and Jake Martin on the saxophone. And it's a nice instrumental piece from our first record. So let's talk about Frank Zappa. Let's talk about his music, that song, and how he got into our lives, and a little bit about that session. Who wants to take it? Well, why don't we start with talking about how do we meet Frank Zappa musically? It goes a way back for us, doesn't it?
My recollection is that the Singleton brothers, James, who's right here, and brother John, who played drums in some of those early bands, had the first couple of Zappa albums, and I think that would have been the late 60s, and we sort of became fascinated by Frank Zappa because he was so unusual at the time. And as I also recall that,
and still, to be fair, right? I mean, it's not like music is rushed forward and everything sounds like Zappa.
No, and he continued to do. He never did the same thing twice, and so on. And I remember being interested in the song King Kong because another guy that we played with at some point at Springfield High, Jim Laurie, a drummer, he had an older brother who had a band that did King Kong, and we thought that was so cool that we needed to give it a try. That's what I remember. Jim, does that sound like what you remember?
It does. It does. The Zappa seemed to intentionally flout conventionality, which was always appealed to me, and I think to all of us.
Well, yeah, and we were teenagers, right? We were teenage boys, and we were rebelling against, basically, to quote the old Marlon Brando line, what do you got? We were growing up in Springfield, Illinois, and we felt the confines of the culture there, and we were pushing out as I think our age cohort was doing everywhere, and Zappa was sure a way to do it because he did flout convention, and he was a tinkerer and an experimenter. I mean, all that weird, Charles, what is that? Would you call it musique concrète? I mean, it was the sound effects
on there. Everything that's electronic manipulation of pre-existing sounds. That's exactly what it is, musique concrète, and that Zappa's own musical heritage is a weird mix of like French avant-garde music of the 20th century. He was fanatical about Edgar Varese when he was a teenager.
We had no idea who these people were.
And at the same time, he was listening to doo-wop and Johnny Guitar Watson and playing in these early
blues,
rhythm and blues bands. And through some kind of a very unique.
Well, there was something with Zappa. I think throughout his career, there was always something for somebody to love, and then a couple minutes later, something for that same person to detest because he just mixed it up and he just didn't freaking care. And some of the stuff that was fascinating to me was, I mean, of course, he was a guitarist, and looking at him as a guitarist, that's just kind of a separate thing. But it's the fact that he was these quick edits, these quick cuts, but also the studio chatter. Some of which was, impromptu. Some of which was, these characters, Susie Cream Cheese and this and that talking. So there's this social commentary going on, plus the weird electronic sounds and the sounds and what the heck is going on with these guys, right?
Well, that was his musique concrète personality. Like everything that they recorded and everything that somebody said into a microphone. And every noise that happened became grist for his editing mill, which he initially in those days, of course, was doing with tape and razor blades. And then later he became a nut for the synclavier and some of the early digital tools. But he always had that aspect. And yet at the same time, he had these bands that could play a lot of that stuff live. So it wasn't, it was all conceived in the studio, but then they also did it live, which was unusual for that type of stuff.
Well, he was a notoriously tough taskmaster as a band leader too, and a lot of really great players went through his shop over the years. But he was very tough. I mean, he was, we think of him as just sort of this free spirit and this political commentator and social commentary, and doing anything. But but it seemed like everything he did was very intentional and very worked out. And he liked to have it done a particular way, which is kind of funny, given that we picked a song that relatively simple, and we approached it in a pretty simple, straightforward way. There's a melody, there's the head, and we decided, I think when we recorded it, we said, okay, here's the melody. We're gonna do the melody at the front. We're gonna do the melody at the end, and in the middle, we're just gonna see what happens, right? So it was kind of unusual. It's unusual to treat a Frank Zappa song as a kind of a jam band spirit to it, which I think we brought to it. So.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was successful about it is that although it wasn't planned, I'd like to think that when you listen to it, you can tell that the musicians were actually listening to each other, and that the ideas circulated, and that at the same time I remember it was at the very end of a long recording day, and we were having so much fun doing that just when it seemed like it was about to be the end, somebody would go off in a different direction, and it kept going for a while. I remember that.
Yeah, and I remember Jason just having this swirling energy.
Yes, and that's a great way to put it.
And I remember thinking that it would be a pretty easy one to get a take on. I'm kind of glad we did more challenging stuff first, because then we had this kind of release in that performance.
Well, I love the swirling energy of Jason Marsalis is a good phrase, because from my vantage point in Esplanade Studios, I could look across at you guys and I could see through into the booth where Jason was set up.
Right. And
I could see him, and there were some songs where he occupied an enormous amount of space. They talk about in atoms, that the electrons are constantly moving, but like how much space do they take? That one, and also the climax of Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, which we'll talk about on another day. All of a sudden, he was enormous because he was reaching out full length. He was getting all the cymbals, getting all the drums, and he was just simultaneously occupying an enormous amount of that booth, and just an incredible energy, which you also guys. And I don't know how you found that energy that late in the day, because it just takes off.
But
that's the go button, right?
Yeah, it's actually the bass and the drums made it it's very easy to play over. And I also would think it's interesting to add that obviously the three of us had played together a lot. I had played with Jason. James has played with Jason. Jake Martin, you guys met him that morning, and he played on a couple of tunes, and basically that was about the first time. That and the melodramas were the first time that the five of us had ever played together.
Yeah. Well, you remember, think about our heritage, the three of us and the bands that we played in, starting 50 years before that session. Which is incredible. The roots of all that, we were not a Zappa band. King Kong was a stretch for us then. The heart and soul of the bands that we did back in our musical youth was jam bands. It was Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane, and we were getting turned on to things like Miles Davis and things like that. But Santana, but yeah, so we played 15-minute version of Soul Sacrifice. We did Saint Stephen by the Grateful Dead. So, and we did versions of what was it? Neil Young, Down by the River, just a 2-chord alternation. We could milk that for 45 minutes. So in a way, King Kong the jam on that was kind of us going back to those roots, because we didn't plan anything out, and yet some structure and shape emerged. The one on the record is the only complete take. It's the only time that we all did it. So it has that kind of, I'm glad we caught that, because it had that kind of freshness and that energy, and who the hell knows how it's going to turn out. Let's just hope that it does,
You know,
Form is determined by content.
There you go.